Hello, YouTube. This will be my first book review. The site is Philbilly WV. On my site, I'm a multi-topic site. I mostly cover fitness, push-ups, golf, pop culture, fun stuff. But I also want to cover some books as the channel progresses. And my first book review is going to be on a book I recently completed, Cobb, a Biography by Al Stump. First of all, what made me want to read this book? One, I like baseball. Two, here in West Virginia, this part of West Virginia, we're big Cincinnati Reds fans. And we all remember Pete Rose. He broke Ty Cobb's hit record. Cobb at the time had 44,189 hits, and Pete Rose broke it. Unfortunately, he was with the Philadelphia Phillies at the time instead of the Cincinnati Reds. Interestingly, Cobb started his career in Detroit with the Detroit Tigers, but he finished his career with Philadelphia. But back then, they were called the Philadelphia Athletics. And Pete Rose ultimately ended up with like 4,256 hits. But we're all Reds fans, and Ty Cobb stuck in our memory due to Pete breaking his record. Another reason I wanted to read this book, Ty Cobb was the type of guy that capitalized on his fame and fortune and prowess in baseball. He got into all kinds of stocks and bonds and ran around with high rollers and got very rich out of it. That always intrigues me. Then another reason I wanted to read the book is a childhood memory I have. I couldn't have been more than 5 years old, and I remember, of course, collecting baseball cards, being with some older fellas in the neighborhood. This would be Rawl, R-A-W-L, West Virginia. On the back of baseball cards, or maybe something else, there was a trivia question about who had the most hits. And of course, the answer at that time, this is before Pete Rose broke the record, was Ty Cobb. So the older fellas tried to give me some hints. They acted like they were tying their shoes for Ty and act like they were eating corn on the cob for the Cobb part, but I didn't get it. But for whatever reason, that always stuck in my mind. So the name Ty Cobb was always stuck in my mind due to that. So even though Ty Cobb passed away before I was even born, and he played baseball in the early 20th century, I've still always been interested in Ty Cobb. So I've noticed this book back in the 90s when I'd go to, that's 1990s, bookstores and whatnot, but I just got around to reading it here in 2024. So that gives you a little background on why I wanted to read the book. Now, this book in itself is somewhat controversial. The author, as I said, was Al Stump. Back in 1961, the book publisher Doubleday and Ty Cobb, and I guess if he had an agent or whatever, they chose Al Stump to be the writer of his autobiography, which was called My Life in Baseball, The True Story, or something like that. And again, Al Stump was the writer chosen. I guess you'd call him a ghostwriter. Maybe his name appeared on some editions. I'm not exactly sure of that. But Al Stump supposedly lived with him for a few weeks or months and put together the story, the book, the biography, which listed as an autobiography, and got to know Ty Cobb real well. And the book was published in 1961, but Cobb was very sick at the time Stump was working with him, and he ultimately passed away before Cobb's book, My Life in Baseball, was published. Just a few months or so before the book was actually released. At the time, Al Stump said that he discovered all these crazy things, but the publisher and the Cobb people and Cobb kept him from telling the complete story. So Stump claimed that he wanted to set the record straight by publishing a new account of Cobb's life story. And he did that first in 1994. He wrote a book called Cobb, The Life and Times of the Meanest Man in Baseball. And that book generated a movie at the time, a theatrical release starring Tommy Lee Jones as Ty Cobb, and I think the actor Robert Wall played Al Stump. But it was based on that first book that Stump wrote in follow-up to his ghostwriting of the Cobb story back in '61. But then in 1996, they expanded on that book, and which was this product, Cobb, a Biography, and this was released in 1996. Interestingly, Al Stump passed away before this version was released. So just like Ty Cobb passed away before My Life in Baseball was released, Al Stump passed away before this book was released. But this book has all kinds of crazy stories about Ty Cobb. I mean, a lot of it is pretty, I assume, pretty factual, but there's a lot of craziness in this and crazy allegations. Cobb had a tendency to play rough. Supposedly, he liked to, when he stole a base, lift his spikes up and hurt people and sharpen his spikes to do that. Always in a fight, beat up umpires, beat up fellow players, get into fights with fans. And Stump made the claim in this book that at one point on the streets of Detroit, somebody tried to, or a group of people, a couple people or so, tried to mug or rob Cobb, and he pulled his pistol and it wouldn't go off or misfired, so he chased one of them down and pistol whipped him to death. But that is one of the stories about this book, factoids listed in this book that some people doubt the veracity of. In later years, there's been a few books and writers and historians to come out to say that a lot of this book is fabrication and not really true, and that Al Stump was just capitalizing on his greatest success in his life, which is writing the Cobb books and articles, and that he needed to keep on the gravy train some more and write these later Cobb books to keep his cash flow coming in, and he added all kinds of false material to it to sell books. And one of the writers who's made this allegation is a writer named Charles Learson. Matter of fact, I just bought one of his books, a biography of Butch Cassidy that I plan to read. But Learson wrote a later biography of Cobb where he tried to point out some of the inaccuracies in this book and false accusations that he claimed Stump did to make money. And he also went on to say, or others went on to say, that when Cobb was staying with, or when Al Stump was staying with Cobb to do his biography / autobiography, that he actually stole some of his memorabilia to sell in later years. But who knows? Who knows? Regardless of what's true in this book and what's not true, there's still a lot of information to be gained from it. And it is a well-written book, and I enjoyed reading it and learned a lot about Ty Cobb. But with any nonfiction book you read, you got to research it, vet it, because there could be inaccuracies in anything, and this is a good example of something. But this is not a good example, because this is the guy wrote 3 books about Cobb. So, but any book you read, you got to sort of research a little bit and see what's real and what's not real. But nevertheless, I learned quite a few interesting things about Ty Cobb from reading this book. Of course, we all know all the records he has, and still many records he still has to this day. I'm not going to go into the records. You can read this book or another book about Cobb or Google it. But of course, Ty Cobb had the hit record until Pete Rose broke it. And Ty Cobb is still second in hits with the 4189. He, among other records, he has the most base stealing of home. He stole home base from third more than anybody, or I guess some of the times he went from second all the way to third. I think there's even instances of him going from hitting the single and stretching all the way to home. He was a master of base stealing. He was super fast, and he was very smart in his base stealing. And he even would do dirty tricks, even hide the ball tricks, if you can believe that, to facilitate his base stealing. And one of the things that intrigued me is that even though Cobb played in the early 20th century, I think he was active from 1905 to 1926. He played about 22 years in the big leagues, all with the Detroit Tigers, except for his last year or two with the Philadelphia Athletics. But he sort of used modern training techniques with his speed work. He even before he broke into baseball, he had ordered a book about an Olympic runner, and which gave techniques of how to increase his speed. Of course, this is back when they didn't have proper tennis shoes, and of course from the running game, no starting blocks or anything like that. But Cobb was smart enough and interested enough to use what we may call modern training techniques to get faster. And one preseason, he even ran with weights in the preseason to try to increase his speed. I found that to be very interesting, especially so long ago. And Cobb worked on his game and trained when a lot of guys did not. Besides the records, I mean, as previously alluded to, you got to, quote, talk about the craziness of Cobb with all these fights and whatnot. I mean, despite Stump puffing it up here, he was involved in a lot of fights and whatnot. He was a rough, tough guy. One of the things that Stump and other writers have done is try to magnify what a racist guy Cobb was, which, that time in the country, he was from Georgia. Matter of fact, he's nicknamed the Georgia Peach, Ty Cobb. He harbored some racist feelings, but later writers such as Learson have indicated that Cobb was actually for the integration of baseball and was gave high praise to Roy Campanella and players like that, and maybe even financially supported some minority players breaking into baseball back in the day. So if that's correct, Cobb had changed his ways quite a bit and became more progressive in that area. In Cobb's career, he concentrated on hitting. He could hit to all areas of the field, and he was more into hitting than he was in the power hitting and hitting home runs. When he first broke in, he was competing with all the old-time stars like Honus Wagner and people like that. At the end, or middle and end, he was competing against the great Babe Ruth. And Babe Ruth revolutionized baseball with hitting the bomb, the home run. And, of course, the live ball versus dead ball story had something to do with that. But Cobb was more interested in hitting for average and getting a bunch of hits, which he said naturally led to runs, then stretching those hits with base stealing to produce runs for his team to win. But this book points out there was a time period, just a few games, where Cobb experimented with power hitting. He actually hit quite a few home runs in the 1, 2, 3 game period that he was experimenting with it, which sort of meant that if he'd have concentrated on hitting home runs, maybe he'd have been a big home run hitter as well as a average hitter or hitting for average type of hitter. One of the things this book and other books have pointed out that I'm very confused on is a batting grip that Cobb used. He supposedly used a split handed grip. I just don't understand how that, of course, if you're bunting, that would work. But if you're taking a full swing, I don't know how a split grip would help, because you're losing the pivot point of the end of the bat, the fulcrum. From physics and mechanics, I just don't know how that would work. Maybe if he's trying to spray a ball to a certain part of the field, that would work. But some people have even theorized that he may have started that way, and then as he completed the swing, he brought his hands back together. I don't know. I'm not that expert of baseball to figure that out. But I found the split grip technique of holding the bat very confusing, but very interesting at that. Another factoid interesting about this was Cobb was one of the first players. I always thought that like Ted Williams in baseball and Arnold Palmer in golf was the two guys that got the big advertising money into professional sports. But even back at the turn of the 20th century, Cobb was getting advertising from various companies. He would be in plays and actually in a movie or two. So he was using mass media to help his money grow. Even back then, you think that's a modern thing, but Cobb was doing it in the early 1900s. I found that to be a very interesting aspect of this book. Another book, or another, maybe this is the next, another aspect of this book that you got to point out when you're talking about Ty Cobb is that he had a great tragedy when he was breaking into baseball. And maybe that explains why he was such a rough, mean player. His mother accidentally shot and killed his father at the time when he was a teenager breaking into baseball. Or she thought that he was a robber or something breaking into the house. He came home early from a trip or something, and she shot him as he was coming through a window or something. And there was a trial and everything. She was exonerated in it, but such a tragedy to befall anybody. And maybe that put him in a mindset that him against the world mentality or whatnot. And back then, they would haze the rookies pretty bad. So when he first got to the Detroit Tigers, they hazed him pretty hard, pretty bad. And that probably gave a big chip on his shoulder as well. Maybe that helps to explain some of his rough style of play and liking to fight and whatnot. Another interesting factoids I got from this book, Cobb loved to golf. I loved golf myself, but Cobb really liked to golf. And training camp for the Detroit Tigers was in Augusta, Georgia. And there was some golf course in Augusta. I haven't researched yet to see if it was the Augusta where the Masters is played. Cobb got to play that quite a bit. And supposedly the first time he played it, he shot a 69. But I don't know how accurate that is. But then the book alluded that he lost his game a little bit. And that he was so disappointed with his putting. Of course, back then the putters were much different than they are now. But to try to help his putting game, he got a baseball bat and put like a putting blade on it and would putt with that. And then after he retired from baseball, he actually played on a golf tour on the West Coast. So he always loved golf, which intrigued me. Another thing, Cobb's father that was killed was some sort of judge and landowner and academic. So Cobb was actually a heavy reader. He loved to read, and he was interested in intellectual things and whatnot, despite his rough background. As I previously alluded, Cobb used his baseball career to become a millionaire. I mean, I guess the main thing that made him a millionaire, he got into, of course, being from Georgia, he got in with the Coca-Cola people real early and had all kinds of stock in Coca-Cola, which made him a fortune. Being in Detroit at the eve of the car industry, he got into General Motors and other, like one time he was advertised for Huckmobile, whatever that is. So he got in early with some of the automotive companies that made him a lot of money, stock with Coke. He was always into cotton shares and all kinds of other stocks and bonds, and he had auto dealerships. Interestingly, he was so good at playing the stock market that when the Depression hit in the 30s, it didn't affect him as much as it did other people. He stayed on a solid financial footing even through the Depression. Of course, according to Stump, he claimed it was his skills in the stock market, not some agent or financial advisor or something. Cobb, another thing that intrigued me about Cobb, he loved guns and hunting. He was a big outdoorsman. He loved to hunt. He had a lot of big trophies he took. He went on an African safari one time to help with his trophy. And at one point he wanted the Big Seven or whatever they call it. I think he missed out on some kind of sheep or something where he didn't get to complete that. Cobb, he had several children by his first wife, and he was married a couple times after that. But due to his baseball career and being out playing golf all the time and hunting all the time, he wasn't the best husband and father, according to this book. Um, he also hung with a lot of famous people. He hung with presidents. He's golfed with Eisenhower, and he hung with a lot of famous high rollers and big people back in the day. Um, Again, the book is well written, all kinds of interesting stories about Ty Cobb, but again, I don't know if I can recommend you reading this book because of the controversy surrounding it and the supposed inaccuracies and false accusation this book contains. So maybe if you want to read a Ty Cobb book, maybe you want to get one of the later ones that's better researched or whatnot. But I enjoyed reading this book, and I may or may not read another Ty Cobb book. Reading this book has piqued my interest in reading the Babe Ruth book, so I think one of the next books I read, I'm going to choose a good Babe Ruth biography. But that will complete my first book review here, and more to come in the future. Later.